You are listening to the Gritty Podcast, where we talk about all things gritty. Welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Cullen. I'm joined today by Brad Hunt, and we are on the final chapter of Crow Killer, the Saga of Liver-Eating Johnson. Last week we left off. He found the Pegan girl. They also we found Captain Jack of the Ute, the chief. Ute chief, who was hung from a tree alive by
Mariano Modeno.
Mm-hmm. Just random little legends and stories of things that mountain men witnessed and happened. And they left him hanging there. Delgue. So Delgue and Wide Eye are two of the main sources from which the stories in this book are told, who lived, it seems, into older age, especially Wide Eye, who died in 1956.
46, I believe.
46?
He was like 92 years old.
I think it was 56.
Maybe it was 56.
Yeah, I think it was well after World War II.
I think it was 46 because there were 2 years of like World War II that he was kind of a part of, like his last 2 years. Because 1944, 46.
Someone died in 1956 that we talked about last. So anyway, the point is, he lived well into the 1900s.
Yes.
And he told these stories. So the Blackfeet in the cabin. Okay, 1946.
Yep.
So here we are in the story. We're going to dive right into it. It's our last chapter. I did want to read this comment. So this is kind of funny. I mean, I needed to clarify a few things about cannibalism and human beings eating human beings. And our buddy James Mooney, he typed this on episode 5, where I made a little clarification here, and this is kind of funny. Look, I don't have like these moral quandaries about eating. If I'm stuck on a ship in the middle of the ocean and there's only one dead guy there, I don't care if it's my mother or my best friend. Like at the point, once they're dead,
survive.
They are just protein at that point. And not that I would relish it. I'm just saying. It's practical. I just don't see...
it's a life or death situation.
I don't know. I feel like I am very disconnected from the human body as the individual. Like I picture a soul in a person.
Right.
But they're gone.
Right.
And this is just the house that it was in. I don't know. It's going to rot here in a few days, so you better eat it if you're going to live. But this, James wrote... He said, ha, ha, ha. When we find ourselves in a hole, we should stop digging. Since you dug a little further, I believe it was the larger men in the Donner Party who died first. So Lampers would probably outlast Brian. Unless Brian, which I wouldn't put it past him, would know this fact and would act with CrossFit speed and strength, along with jiu-jitsu submission skills, harvest the dreadful and unwanted task of survival, also known as supper. So sleep lightly, Ryan. But maybe Brian and Ryan are in this together, i.e. bringing in Mark Livesey. Mark, appearing to be well marbled, could be rendered down tastily, making pemmican. Mark might much taste like beer battered bear. But this only after eating through Mark's pack animals. After all, and at last, topping this all off with the sweet, tasty treat of Pedro, with Brian saying lastly, and a grin, "Where's the leak? Where's the hole? Oh, here it is. It's just below your rib." Brian might much be like fat bastard saying, like fat bastard saying, "Get in my belly." Brian returning safely home, and with the appearance of weight gain. Not on jerky meat claimed bears killed Ryan, Mark, and sweet Pedro. The only remains found of the three were the top knots, which Brian tethered to his Peaks trekking poles.
Oh, jeez.
Thus, Brian, his family, and the families of the 3 lost men, which Brian now oversaw, all lived happily ever after. Of course, only with proper sponsorship from Mountain Ops, Crispy Boots, Peaks, and Go Hunt. And that concludes story time. Thanks, Brian, you weirdo. Anyways, where's Gritty Bro Man? I miss seeing him. You didn't eat him, did you? Ha ha, just joking, Brian, don't eat me. Brent is going to be here tomorrow, actually, to get us through another book about Daniel Boone, which is one of my favorite books that that I've read about this period. I like it even better than this one. Although this one is full of really tall tales.
Yes.
The other one seems less apocryphal and more
truthful, I guess you could say.
More factual.
Factual. There you go.
And yet no less like astonishing.
Yeah.
You know, in so many ways. So that was a funny comment. I had to read it out loud. Kevin Tom said, "This has been interesting. Thank you." He says, "On the subject of literature reading in the future, what is the criteria for subject matter, Brian? Would you like to state turn of the century-ish, interest in World War I or II era?" I have another book called A Higher Call that I want to read.
Mm-hmm.
I have another book from World War II, a couple of them that have just been, I think, remarkable reads.
And I love like all that World War II history stuff, like diving into it. I love that stuff. You know, it's super fascinating actually. And like, you know, the growth of Hitler and how it started and
The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which I read years ago, which is just a voluminous piece of literature.
Yes.
But you know what? I think for now, though, I do want to stick to mountaineering, mountain men, and this turn of the century type stuff because I think it really coincides with what it is that we're doing and puts things in perspective for us. And there's little tidbits to learn from this era. And I don't like the rewrite of history that's recently occurring. And this is just my little part in helping those that, especially young people who didn't really get an honest look at history, or at least a more balanced look at history. Yeah. I like presenting this. So I got another. Nathan Winters writes, "Gross, Brian. Humans aren't food." and James says, "Yeah, Brian, you sicko." Look, I'm just saying, meat is meat. At some point, you know, when I saw Ranella talk about the monkey thing in South America, and he's like, "Yeah, I couldn't want to eat them, you know, just because I did, but there was something about it that bothered me." Is there something wrong with me?
No.
I've often wondered, like, is there something wrong with me? Like,
I don't think so. Like, I honestly feel like
am I a savage?
People will be like, "Oh, you would eat your horse," and it's like, "Our horse is already dead." Yeah, and there's like,
I'd eat my dog.
There's some good meat on that horse, you know. And I've heard horse, like I've never had it, but I've heard horse doesn't taste too bad. So,
yeah. Anyway, there you have it. We're sickos.
Little do you know, James, that I'm the one that's going to eat Brian, Ryan, Mark Levisay.
You left Brad out of the mix. So
Pedro, I like spice, that Spanish, you know. You might have a little spice.
I like that. Oh, where's the hole now, Pedro? All right. Well, let's get back into the book. Before we do, we want to remind you about those sponsors that James mentioned.
Yeah.
Like Mountain Ops. Check them out. Use the code GRIDDY over there. Stealthy Nutrition. Peaks Equipment. We haven't mentioned them in a while. Trekking poles, gaiters, headlamps, and more to come. Initial Ascent. We've got a few.
Dark Energy.
Go to the
those battery
Dark
packs.
Energy. We just used a bright orange one on our last hunt. Finally, they made an orange one you will not lose instead of a camouflage one that you can't find for 15, 20 minutes.
Or a black one that falls in the crack of a rock and you're searching for 20 minutes. Not saying that I've done that before or not. But anyway, yes.
Yes, everything dipped in orange. So there you have it. Use the code GRIDDY over at Dark Energy. We've been using those chargers for years. I have some from 2015 that are still rocking and hold a charge and are impervious to cold. One of the problems with a lot of chargers today is if they get cold at all, later season, they're just dead. The batteries die. Same with my old cameras.
And you'll
I used to have to sleep with them, keep them on my body, put them in my pouches.
I still do like always keep a battery
in there.
like in my pocket, you know. So it's always, especially those cold weather hunts, just because it does eat them up. But
all right. Thank you for supporting us. As always, those codes can be found, and links to all of our partners that support us can be found in the description field. If you're looking for gear before you go out and buy, always check that out because it helps us out, and you'll get a deal. Yep. Everybody wins. Okay, 8 scalps for the crows. Johnson's destination when he first met the Piegan was a rendezvous on the Mussel Shell, but at the mouth of the Rosebud, he found all who were scheduled to meet at that rendezvous. Yellowstone Kelly, chief of scouts to General Nelson Miles' command, a position to be held at the next year by Johnson, had just come in from the Tongue River, where the Sioux were gathering for what looked like a do-or-die battle. With Kelly were Del Gue and Jim Moorman, and another old frontiersman, Moorman. Some 25 Crow scouts were at the camp under the command of their own chief, Black Eagle. The scouts had gathered a large supply of meat and other provisions. They had more than enough saddle and pack horses. They had a first-rate commander in Kelly, but they also had Sam Grant terrorizing the Crows. Sam was the especially black Negro who, the year before, had put Charlie Siringo, the famous Texas cowboy, out of active business. If Charlie's own story of the event may be prejudiced, it just reflects the reputation which Sam Grant took care to establish for himself. I was seated on the ground by the campfire smoking late in the evening, Siringo wrote in 1885, when Grant rode up and dismounted. Picking up my pistol, which lay on the opposite side of the fire from where I was sitting, he examined it, then threw it away, at the same time pulling his pistol with the remark, "Why don't you have a good one like mine?" He then fired at my heart. My hands were clamped around my left leg, the knee being on a level with my heart. The large dragoon bullet struck the knee, going through and lodging near the skin on the opposite side. He was raising the pistol as though to fire again, Siringo judged, when a cowboy friend of Siringo's, also Negro, galloped up. Grant swore that his pistol had gone off by accident and then galloped away, and sent a doctor out late that night to cut the bullet out of Siringo's knee. Siringo had 35 years to ponder Grant's motives before a friend told him, in time for a later version of Siringo's memoirs, that a certain wealthy cattleman hired Sam Grant to kill him. Why don't you have a good one like mine?
Boom.
Boom. Oh, it went off by accident. I'm sorry. I'll send a doctor back.
Yeah.
It was in any event Sam Grant's reputation that he dealt extensively in murder, and that, though quarrelsome, he preferred to kill in stealth. Town marshals along the Chisholm Trail had sworn to kill him. Oh, Sam Grant's not a good dude.
No.
Grant had, it seems, come up the Bozeman Trail with a herd of cattle for the Northern Army posts, but had now deserted. 3 days before Johnson's arrival, he had ridden into the camp of the scouts and attached himself to them. Though advised by Kelly that his services were not needed, he had simply grinned, announced himself as staying regardless, and added that he knew how to kill Indians. Man, he's a dick.
Yeah, exactly.
Somehow he persuaded the Crows that he was interested in killing them he was as interested in killing them as in killing Sioux. By the time Johnson came into camp, Jim Mormon could tell him that the Crows wanted to tie up and burn the varmint. Johnson was seated on the ground among the Crow scouts, smoking with Black Eagle against the buffalo skin teepee, while Mormon spoke. He had been watching with satisfaction how capably Waving Grass could broil antelope steak. That was the Pegan girl. Now he looked at Black Eagle and the other Crow warriors scattered about, but either they had not heard Mormon or they had nothing to add. Action about Sam Grant would be up to Johnson. "Burnin's too cruel," Johnson said. He saw Mormon's astonishment. "Where is this black galoot?" "Among them trees," Mormon said, camped alongside their spring. "Says he might get mad and piss in their water." "He'll never piss in your water," Johnson promised, lessened by his carcass floating in it. "Ye know I ain't seen since yesterday." He ate the steaks Waving Grass brought him, slowly with relish, the Crows around him, awaiting with anticipation his equally slow approach to Sam Grant. Now, the legend has it that Johnson was curious, having never seen a Negro before. And indeed, he likely had seen none since coming west. The cowboy that sat now was seated in a clearing among the pines, mending his saddlebags, and quite unconscious of Johnson's approach. A short distance away, beyond the trees, his horse nosed aside dry leaves to get at the sparse grass. Grant was a big man physically, rusty black in color. He was dressed in cowboy jeans and flannel shirt. His wide belt held 2 pistols and a large bowie. He hummed as he plied his needle with his white teeth, and his white teeth flashed. Suddenly he looked up, and Johnson saw how his eyes expressed amazement. He had heard no sound, yet this stranger stood beside him. Grant dropped his sewing and looked around him. Indian faces, Crow faces in war paint, peered from among the trees. "Them won't hurt you," the white stranger said as Sam Grant rose to his feet. "Them is here to see you move on down the road." Sam Grant looked into the stranger's strange, hard eyes and looked away, but he said, "Reckon you don't know who I am, white man." There was a guffaw from among the trees. Delgue and Jim Mormon came forward. Yellowstone Kelly, to their regret, was out of camp since morning and could not see the fun. "Reckon it's the other way around, black feller," Jim said. "Reckon you don't know Johnson here." Grant put his hand on his pistol butt. Johnson stood with thumbs hooked in his belt. "The hell with who you are. I'm offering you your life. Now get on your horse and get out of here." Sam Grant drew his right-hand pistol fast, but in too close quarters. As the gun left its holster, Johnson seized Grant's wrist, stepping to one side as Grant's bullet dug into the ground. Still holding Grant's wrist in an iron grip with his own right hand, Johnson grasped his opponent's neck, now with his left, and with the leverage threw both their weights upon the Negro's gun arm. Grant's elbow cracked and snapped. Despite what must have been terrible pain, he reached for his left-hand gun. But swiftly the liver-eater backheeled him, threw him some 10 feet, and drew his stone tomahawk. Hurled from a distance of about 10 feet, the terrible weapon turned over once and struck the Negro fairly between the eyes.
Jeez.
Jim Mormon withdrew the tomahawk from Sam Grant's skull as the crows crowded around. Waving Grass took the weapon from Jim's hand and carried it to the spring to wash off the blood. Johnson turned to Black Eagle. "You can have his scalp and his horse and his weapons," he said.
Wrong move, Mr. Grant.
He offered him his life just to get on the horse and go.
Yeah.
I think Sam Grant got away with a lot.
He did. I was trying
For a
to
long
look.
time.
I don't see it a lot, but they were saying something about like he was just killing. What was it? Where'd it go?
He just thought he could just kill anybody he
Yeah.
wanted. No one.
Yep. I don't see a lot.
So he snapped his right arm when he drew his gun at the elbow or something like
and
that.
he reached for his left.
Then when he reached for his left,
The famous kick of.
he put him to the ground.
Yep.
And then he just grabbed that tomahawk and just clubbed him.
Yep.
From 10 feet.
Yep.
They have a few stories of him throwing rocks
Yeah.
and weapons, and hitting square on the mark. Now, I've seen a baseball player or a football player. I've seen some of those guys with an arm just whoop.
Right.
And early peoples who had to survive, they were throwing rocks at birds and grouse.
Oh, absolutely.
And, they were wind up, whack. I mean, for survival, they were good at throwing.
Yeah.
They probably threw constantly.
You would think, I mean, especially during these times, any sort of advantage that you can have against your opponent, if somebody kicks your gun out of your hand or your knife or whatever, you would think.
When I was a kid, we always threw rocks at things to try to kill it.
When I was on the railroad tracks, when I worked for the railroad, we'd be stopped, waiting on trains or whatever, and I'm not joking, we would $1 a throw or whatever. The first one to hit it would get $1. And we'd sit there for a half hour just throwing rocks, at a hole in a tree or whatever.
So Johnson killed him, huh?
Yeah.
Is that the story in the?
Couldn't find much on
whatever?
it. He didn't live a long life, what I could tell.
Sam Grant was taken out by Jeremiah Johnson. He
Yep.
didn't think much of it, did he?
Nope.
Just got over there and was so he tried to draw on him too close,
Yeah.
and he grabbed his wrist before he could shoot him.
Yep.
How many scraps has Jeremiah Johnson been in?
Hundreds.
Gosh dang. All right, here we go. Johnson finding the crows where he did had been pretty much accidental, and in a few days all but Black Eagle and some half dozen of his braves had gone on to their encampment on Big Dry Creek just off the Missouri, where they could keep in daily contact with the Army of the Frontier. The 7 crows who remained along with Johnson, Mormon, and Delgue were to rejoin their fellows as soon as they had accumulated a large enough supply of fresh meat and daily hunting trips from their camp. One moonless night, Dell, on guard duty, while the rest skinned out the meat, heard a moan of pain from the darkness. Dell at once dropped to the ground and worked himself noiselessly toward the sound. As he approached a dry gully leading up from the river, he saw a form crawling toward him. Circling, he came up behind the moving creature. It was a white woman, he found, delirious, scalped alive. Taking the chance that her Indian foe was closer than his own friends, he nevertheless raised the alarm. Johnson was the first to appear. He shouted orders to the Crow scouts to chase down the Sioux who had scalped the woman. Waving grass, preparing a dressing for the woman's head, somehow brought her to lucidity. Johnson saw that she must die in a few minutes and set to learning her story. She was, he learned, the one survivor of 3 families from the Great Bend of the Mussel Shell. 5 days ago, 7 Sioux had struck and killed, then started with her for the camp on the Tongue River. Then, changing their minds about her, they had scalped her. Somehow she had broken away and crawled, she was sure, at least 2 miles.
Jeez.
Imagine being that woman.
Miserable. Freaking miserable.
It was rough. It was rough times, man. 7 Sioux and 2 miles. 7 Sioux and 2 miles, Johnson said to Delgue. They carried the woman into camp, told Waving Grass to minister to her wants, then saddled horses and rode northward up the Porcupine. Though midnight had passed, the sky was clear, and they could see their way. The Crows came back in to report that no Sioux remained in the area, but Johnson sent them out again. If and we can find out where they scalped her, we've got it, he said. We can tell where they're headed. We can tell where they's headed. Dell and Jim Mormon thought there was no secret as to the Indians' destination. They was heading for the Tongue, didn't she say? Now, Dell, Johnson said. Now, Jim. Now, Dell. This coon thought you knew Red Indians better than that. We'll wait here and see what the Crows find out. Black Eagle and his few warriors were gone little more than an hour before they rode back in silently, suddenly out of the gloom. One of the Crows, the owl, handed 2 objects to Johnson in the dim light. The liver-eater could barely make them out. The charred stick from a campfire and a leaf heavy with thickened blood. Where away? The owl pointed westward. You see, Johnson told his friend, them Sioux is backtracking. They know we got the woman's story. So they's trying to ambush us where they killed her folks, Dell said. Something like that, Johnson said. Lead on, Al. They named the Indian right, said Mormon. They rode slowly through the rest of the night, with the owl halting now and then to search out the sign. After the sky lightened, they rode at a sharp trot, with the owl hardly glancing at the ground. Stopping only for meals and for one short rest, they rode all that day and through the next night. Once they saw a large band of Sioux, more than 500 warriors with their entire village trailing along behind, hauling their belongings on travois. They headed to join Crazy Horse. They're headed to join Crazy Horse at Wolf Mountain, Johnson said. Hadn't we better tell Kelly, Dell suggested. But Johnson had more faith in the chief of scouts. Yallerston will cite him himself and report. Y'all are staying? Like the way they write this and the way that they think the mountain talk, none of it makes sense. Even the 7 Sioux whom they were trailing back to the Great Bend of the Mussel Shell had made no effort to join in with this Sioux village on the move, nor would Johnson now turn aside. In their second cold gray dawn, the owl returned from scouting ahead to report that he had reached the cabins. White squaw know how to count, he said. 5 braves sleep in one cabin. 2 watch. The other cabins in the settlement had burned to the ground. Johnson suggested now that they cut at once to the riverbank and come up on the Sioux through a narrow belt of timber. His companions agreed. Dopiek, Black Eagle said. Save one. No kill all. Dopiek is killer. Absorica is crow killer. So he says killer, his name, part of his name. Save one of them, don't kill them all. They left their horses about a half a mile down the river from the cabins and crept through the willows until they were within 200 yards. They could see 3 dead bodies piled together behind the single cabin that still stood. 2 sentries still paced as the owl had described them, but soon one squatted to work the breech of his rifle. Johnson had propped on his elbow, surveyed the scene. He silently worked the block on his .56 caliber buffalo gun, then twisted around to face his companions. That's a big caliber.
Yeah.
I'll take their walking Indian, he said, and Dell can get the other one. Try and get those Indians on their legs. So he wanted them wounded, so that they could take a prisoner.
Ball right to your leg.
Now, Dell, Johnson said. The roar of needle gun and Winchester followed his words at once. So they both shot at the same time, these 2 Indians that were outside the cabin, trying to shoot him in the legs. Yep. The Indian working on his rifle sat for a few seconds' time without uttering a sound, then toppled over. The heavy bullet from Johnson's rifle plowed through the head of the other sentry. Though his skull was smashed, some reflex caused him to stand straight as if alive before toppling onto the sandy earth. One by one, the 5 warriors in their cabin broke into the open, only to receive the combined fire of the party in the timber. Breaking cover at last, the crows raced across the sand toward where their enemies lay. 2 of the 5 had been killed outright. A third died before the crows could reach him. Of the remaining 2, Johnson was first to reach one. Wounded in both legs and in the shoulder, Johnson tomahawked him, even as he sang the first note of his death song. The last of the 7 Sioux warriors, though both his legs were broken, tried to raise his rifle, but Black Eagle knocked the weapon from his grasp and quickly scalped him. The victim was disabled and maimed, but he could still witness what special ceremony Black Eagle had planned for him. "Dopiek," Black Eagle cried, "will you help to avenge your brothers the crows?" Johnson knew Black Eagle's intent, knew what sort of crow vengeance could be accomplished only by the crow killer. For through the years of his life and their feuding, the crows had suffered the contempt of many tribes, but above all that of the Sioux. He drew his bowie. Leaning now over one of the dead warriors, slowly, expertly, so that all might see his proficiency, he made the necessary incision. Reaching in, he drew out a Sioux liver. The Crow warrior stood proudly erect, watching the proceedings, and watching in the same moment how the one surviving Sioux watched too. The one-time Crow killer stood now in front of this scalped and suffering Sioux brave. Holding the liver on high, he brought it down to his mouth. He bit. Then grimacing, he spat. He threw the organ into the face of the watching Sioux brave. "That there ain't fit for a dog to eat," Johnson said. The Crows took their captive down the river where Johnson and Mormon and Gyu could not see their final treatment of him. The trappers dug one common grave for the white settlers whose bodies they gathered. Finally, they dragged the bodies of the 6 dead Sioux into the cabin 4 of them had slept in, and burned the cabin down. The 3 mountain men rode ahead of the Crows as the party started back for their camp on the Big Porcupine. 7 Sioux scalps flapped from the headstalls of 7 Crow bridles. Black Eagle rode ahead to say to the liver eater, "Dopiek," for this the Absorka thank you. Delgue is witness that Johnson looked away for a moment before he answered Black Eagle toward the south, toward the valley of the Little Snake, perhaps where young Crow warriors had incurred his enmity 30 years before. But Johnson's eyes were unfathomable. "The Crows don't owe me nothing," he replied. Yeah, it makes you happy for 2020. In 2021, 2022, it makes you happy for modern life.
Right,
in
exactly.
So many ways, That's why I always find it's like the way we judge the past. You weren't there. You didn't go through it.
No.
The savagery and the brutality that existed has been the story of mankind and humanity for most of existence.
Forever.
And it's only in the modern wealth of what the world is today with technology that we're in a totally different world. And so to judge that, I've lived in a primitive fashion. Where am I going to get my water today?
Yep.
Where am I going to get my food? Did I run out of food? And every day is a struggle just to stay warm while you're hunting for 10, 14 days in a row.
Right.
And when you get back and you have hot water running from the tap heater that stays up, AC when it's hot.
Yeah.
It's like
YouTube for entertainment.
Like there's just there's no struggle.
No.
None.
None.
Which I also think contributes to the unhappiness of
absolutely.
humanity on hold.
So look what's going on in the South right now with the floods and stuff. I mean, I think about that and I'm like, man, we got water purification like we do it in the hills all the time. Like we'd be fine. There are hundreds of thousands of people that doesn't occur to them, because they don't go out there and do that. Yeah. They're so dependent on running water and clean water, coming from a well or something.
Yep.
That I don't know.
Honestly, I just feel that there is a human beings, we need to struggle.
Absolutely.
We need to find a way we need to have some degree of obstacles in our life, and comfort is the enemy of happiness.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem so, but especially if you take comfort for granted. Comfort can be great if every day you recognize the miracle that is electricity and warm water and shelter and heat. And I remember pulling up this year to the park to the driveway here, and there was we had our big old trailer over here, and we had moved it. Well, there's like 4 feet of snow around here. I mean, you're just insane. And in the dark, I pull up, and the headlights there, and there's like 20 deer all bedded on that tiny little patch of grass that had been preserved from snow by the trailer that was parked there that had been moved. And they were all huddled up, and the winter was bitterly cold, like 0 degrees, 5 degrees, -5. And I'm sitting here going, imagine if you had to just survive the winter like that.
Yep.
And we have forgotten those kinds of struggles.
Oh, man. Very much so.
All right, back to the book. And also, but imagine, like, if you were, like, these guys, they knew in their heads.
Yeah.
Like, the terrain, rivers. They use these guys as scouts.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we have maps.
Right.
Like digital maps. And even paper maps were a feat,
Yep.
But to be able to know where you're plotted on a map exactly.
Oh, well, let me turn my tracks on. Guess what? It's dark. Oh, I know exactly where I can get back to, know?
Talk about...
We have it freaking easy. So easy.
I remember when I was a kid, I remember getting lost a couple of times.
Oh,
and
me too.
A compass, because back then we didn't have GPS, and we didn't have maps. And I can remember one of the things that kept me from going too far into the mountains was worried about finding my way back, especially after dark.
Yep.
A couple of times I got into some real trouble because, especially on the Oregon coast or in thick forested areas that are flat, everything looked the same.
Yeah.
And I remember going after some elk, and the snow was coming down hard, and I'm like, I'll just follow my tracks. It wasn't coming down; it hadn't snowed, and I went chasing these elk, and I didn't pay attention to anything.
Yeah. No, which way you turned, left, right.
And it was a big forest in Oregon. Everything looked the same. It was just flat forever with just trees and timber. I got way back in there chasing these cow elk with a bow, and I got into bow range 2 or 3 times. And what I had told myself, I'd never been there before. What I told myself was, I'm just going to follow my tracks out. Mm-hmm. This is my early 20s. I'm just going to follow my tracks in the snow. Well, I'm out there about 4.5 hours, and I'm pretty far. And all of a sudden, it's getting dark, and I turn back to follow my tracks out. And all of a sudden, like the blizzard hits.
Yeah.
We didn't have weather forecasts either. No service, no nothing. We didn't know what was happening. We'd been there about 6 or 7 days. I didn't even know this was going to happen that day. And the snow just dumps. And it's just coming down hard. And the tracks disappear within about 20 minutes, 30 minutes.
Right.
Gone. So now all this fresh snow is on top. I have no idea where the hell I am or how to find my way out. Oh. And I remember being pretty scared for the first time, like worried. I'm like, well, you can always find a spot to hold out, but like the last thing I wanted to do was worry everybody, my uncle, my dad, and my cousin Ben and stuff, and then just also be lost out there. And I was pretty green at that time too. I hadn't hunted big forested national forests like this or wilderness areas. And anyway, I ended up going, okay, well, if I go to the river runs downhill, and at some point that river should hit the main road. I could be miles from where I started or where my dad is, but at least once I hit the road, I can hike all the way back. So I did that. I just kept hiking till I ran into the river. I went downhill till I hit a river. Then I started to follow the river. Had I been more aware of the maps ahead of time, or looked at them even ahead of time, or any of that kind of stuff, I could have known. If I'd paid any attention at all, I just went out half-cocked, man. And anyway, then I had I saw a light flashing through the trees here and there. And then I started to go toward the light, which disappeared and come into view depending on the trees. And then I could hear a horn honking. And so then I followed that. And a few hours later, I finally got back to the truck, and it was my Uncle Bill, Ben's dad, and he was flashing the lights and honking the horn to help me find my way back. And he'd been doing it for hours.
Jeez.
Hours. And had he not done that, I would have survived, but I would have spent the night somewhere, and I would have been way, I would have gone miles through the woods to following the river. And there was blowdowns. It was like log over. It was like Tinker Toys, just forever, matchsticks, and it sucked. So I was glad to get out of there, and it was like way late in the night.
Well, I'll say this, even with the maps, there's been a couple times like solo by myself. You think you know the area, and I've had tracks on which save my bacon.
Yeah.
But I'm like cruising around, and I'm like, well, I can just pop back over this ridge, and then I'll hit the trail going down, and then you pop over that ridge, and it's dark, and I'm like, oh shiz, like, I'm no idea. So then you really have to go back to the map, and then you're like, I'm like 2.5 miles away
totally
from where I'm
spot.
supposed to be. Yeah. And so it's like, yes, my bacon was saved by having the map, obviously. If I didn't have that, then sure. Those flat plains and stuff are on the desert.
It amazes me how these guys, like Daniel Boone was one of those, because when you're talking about Appalachia and Kentucky and some of these areas, it's a lot flatter.
Right. And it's thick.
And so these guys being able to find their way through the woods, I'm like, their brains, their ability to know their space. Like when he gets caught by Indians and he escapes and he has to go 200 miles through over and over again, Boone survives because the native people who captured him and he escapes from just assume he can't find his way back and he's going to die in the woods.
And
anyway.
I will say, like, when you have mountains, most of the time, like, you can get to a high point, you can see something familiar, usually.
If you have done the math and the work ahead of time to understand the terrain you're in before you went there.
Right.
Otherwise, you don't recognize anything anyway because you didn't, which back then they, of course, did. But, if you don't have a Go Hunt map, you need to get one.
Right.
Use the code GRITTY, save $20, you get an in-store credit. And you get the map for $30. You get all 50 states.
When you get lost.
You got to have it. And we've been talking about the digital maps on Go Hunt, which is not the digital, but the satellite imagery. It's well worth it.
Yes.
It's well worth it. Just having it for that, but it does a lot more. And the other cool thing is it'll download 10 times as much data in high res than any other map system out there. So you can just like select the entire region that you might be hunting like that. Click of a button, download it immediately, and have all the layers and be ready to go. And it's updating all the time. I prefer the look and feel in the interface, by the way, opposed to what I've used in the past.
Well, and I like you have
my only complaint was what I was telling you. Sometimes it wouldn't update.
Yeah.
Go Hunt map wouldn't update when I would go from this area to the next area. It would take a while to catch up, and then they would just go and draw me in a new spot. I'm like, dang it. I was trying to go here.
Yeah.
That only happened every now and then. And as I talked to Chris and the guys at Go Hunt and stuff, they're like, we're working on it every day. We're getting it snappier, sharper, and faster every day.
Yep.
But what I ended up doing was having 2 map systems open at the same time, and leveraging the positive qualities of each one in both map systems. And I'm telling you, I loved that.
Oh, yeah.
But eventually, I think Go Hunt's going to continue to keep improving that thing. So you're not the times you switch back and forth are going to get fewer and fewer.
And the thing that I like too is, and I've talked about it with guys like Matt Ashley and stuff. But one thing I really really like is like they're open to listening to us who are using it.
Livesay is a freaking map genius.
It's like when we came off our bear hunts. I mean,
Livesay knows everything there is to know about every single map system
and
on
he's
the planet.
Sitting down
And he sits down with the Go Hunt crew weekly almost and gives them, do this, add that, make this happen.
Right.
And
I sent him a list when we got off our bear hunts. I sent him a list of there's like top 5 things that I wish would change or needed updated or whatever. And there was like another 5 things on that. And it was within days of opening the map again. Like a lot of those things have changed. So like giving you the option to move your toolbar and stuff, and the left side, right side, just little things.
I'm telling you, It's worth it. It's only $30.
Yeah.
I can't believe the deal. Use the code Gritty. You'll spend $50. You'll get a $20 in-store credit.
Yep.
Okay, so it says in here, burial for Bear Claw. After the winter campaign of 1876 to 1877, the power of Indians of the Northwest began a steady decline. The victory of General Miles at Wolf Mountain broke the spirit of Crazy Horse and many of his allies. By the way, Crazy Horse is one of my favorite Native person. Not historian,
in
but history.
Yeah.
Like, his character, his personality, his mode of being, his love of his people, it represents for me the ideal person, regardless of race and stuff. Again, someone I deeply admire for so many reasons, and a unique character, unique individual. I think he's a great. He's a great person to read about and to study. Anyway, so this is at that time, but basically after that campaign, though the rounding up of hostile tribes was to take months, it says right here, with the passing of Sioux Might, too, began the passing of the life of Johnson and his friends he had known. They're getting old.
Yep.
Though the rounding up of hostile tribes was to take months, and though indeed there were occasional uprisings and massacres for some 15 more years, settlers and gold hunters and even cattlemen with great herds from Texas swarmed into what had been a wilderness. No doubt the new arrivals found the plains and mountains primeval in their vastness. But for old-time trappers, the old-time feeling of their country had gone. This was the last of the frontier, and they were the last of the frontiersmen. Few of them could be termed old men, yet they had lived beyond their time. The newcomers, and especially the cowboys, they thought of as pilgrim tenderfoots. In the fall of 1878, Delgue and Hatchet Jack found liver-eating Johnson camped at Pryor's Fork on the Yellowstone. The three talked over prospects. Fur was scarce and scalps scarcer. Even proper equipment was hard to come by. Jack, replacing a worn-out hatchet, could find only a model better suited to the driving of nails than for chopping of Indians. But with 3 large pack horses in tow, the partners set out for the Little Rockies below Milk River near Bear Claw's Canyon. Crossing the Yellowstone, then 4 forks of the Musselshell, and finally the Missouri at Johnson's old woodyard, they reached their destination without incident. Sometime before spring, they promised themselves they would go learn whether Bear Claw was in his winter retreat once more. But first, they must get their own winter's work underway. Delgue picked out their campsite, for he had come here before with the master trapper, old Mizzou. Del led his partners to a clear, cold spring in the rocks on the southern slope of the range. While they were building their cabin there, still in mid-October, light snow fell. They agreed that despite the general scarcity of furs so early, a snow was an omen of good trapping. Indeed, Johnson and Jack brought in a large catch the very first week, Del taking his turn as hunter and cook and skinner for the outfit. He had plenty to do. All went well, with no sign of Indians to worry or interest the trappers until mid-December.
Jeez.
Then one evening, Del reported that returning from his day's hunt with the shoulder of an elk, he had heard the discharge of a gun at a distance, likely Bear Claw. Del suggested, though, the incident must be looked into. "You can take their trap lines tomorrow, Johnson said. That weren't Chris a-shootin'. He long ago laid up his meat for the winter. We'll take their trail in the morning, Jack." And he's basically saying, like, I don't think it was Bear Claw Chris.
Yeah.
Because he's already got his meat and he's kind of holding up for the winter. But he's like, it might be their trap lines, he's like, but it doesn't make sense to hear gunshot. Next morning, while the stars still shone, Johnson and Hatchet Jack followed Del's well-beaten trail into the hills till they found where the day before he had broken across the packed snow. They went on in his steps till they found the remains of the elk which he had cached in the tree. More than one shoulder had been cut. Both shoulders, both hams were gone. So someone had come along and taken parts of his elk. It says, 3 red Indians on foot, Jack. Johnson read the signs. He knelt to study further. Blackfoot's, he announced. They heard Dell shoot, but got here after Dell left. Dell was sure in luck. Hatchet Jack quivered like a hound on the leash. Come on, liver-eating, he said. They might have found old Chris. Rifles in hand, they followed the trail at a trot, the hard-caked snow hissing and crackling under their moccasined feet. The Blackfeet's trail led them at last to a broad and shallow canyon. As they rounded one of the many turns they saw, set into a natural niche in the rock wall, a tidy little cabin, but the door stood open. They ran forward to the threshold. Nothing inside, not the pole bunk, not the roughly fashioned chair or the small table, not the bear claw necklaces on the cabin walls seemed to have been disturbed except its owner. Old Bear Claw Chris lay on the earthen floor, his head all clotted blood. One hand held a partly completed necklace of bear claws. Other claws, shaken loose from the buckskin thong upon which the old man had been threading them, were scattered over the floor. Chris had not known he was an Indian's target, but had kept his word till his moment came. Johnson probed in the front wall until he found a crack where the chinks had fallen from between the logs. Chris's failure to watch for the cracks had of course been his death. The heavy caliber bullet had come from the outside and had not stopped in Chris's skull. Johnson sighted roughly, then walked to where the bullet had stopped in the far wall and dug it out with his bowie. Needle gun, he said. Hatchet Jack cursed. Someday, Jack, I gonna quit hunting red Indians and kill off them renegade traders, Jeremiah Johnson promised. There's two sells rifles to Indians down by Fort Peck. There's 2 guys that sell rifles to Indians down at Fort Peck, Jack said. I'll pull their heads. Yeah, the settlers did not like any European, folks who sold, any immigrants, any Americans who sold weapons to Indians, especially those fancy guns.
Yeah.
The body of old Chris was still warm. He had died only this morning, and now Johnson and Jack could piece together that whole night's history. For the Blackfeet's trail to the cabin led in only one direction. They had come upon Chris's cabin only after yesterday's hunting. They had come into the same country where Dell hunted from another direction. They had run to where they heard Dell shot, then lain in wait until darkness, hoping to ambush the hunter. When that hope failed them, they cut off the remaining shoulder and the 2 hams and started back for their camp across country. Their discovery of Bear Claw had been sheer accident. They stayed all night by the cabin, hoping that its owner would open the door. Knowing that other trappers were nearby, they were too smart to fire the cabin. But come early morning, light from inside the cabin shone through the crack in the log wall. One of the Indians shot Chris. Then all 3 smashed his door open, and he who had shot Chris scalped him. Johnson looked around the cabin walls to study what loot the Blackfeet might have taken. Them was Bear Claw's pretties, Jack said, of the necklace hanging there. Johnson shook his head. These here lack matching claws, he said. You'll see that the Blackfoot's got his best. He lifted Chris's head once more and pointed at the bloody clot where the scalp had been taken. Looks like old Moe's looked, Johnson said, and Hatchet Jack nodded. So he was scalped just like old Moe was scalped.
Right.
So they're kind of like, oh, it's this Indian tribe who did it. Only now did the morning sun top the peaks, but even so, early they were hours too late. They hurried from the cabin and along the Blackfeet's clear trail. The Indians had horses now, Chris's no doubt. Suddenly Johnson stopped dead in his tracks, and Jack behind him. Johnson sniffed the air. This child smells smoke, he said. They walked on more cautiously now to the rim of the canyon. There, they looked down on their Blackfeet. Having breakfasted, the 3 warriors were wrestling with a great trunk-like box. While one held the bridle of Chris's skittish pack horse, the other 2 tried to tie on the load. The 2 trappers lay on their bellies and sighted down the heavy rifle barrels. In their shoulder, Jack urged, and Johnson nodded. They would put these Blackfeet out of action without killing them outright. And as their blasting shots echoed around the walls of the canyon, one of the packers of the warrior who held the bridle spun and fell heavily, their entire right shoulders blown away.
Jeez.
The frantic pack horse tore loose. The heavy box fell on the one uninjured Blackfoot. Johnson slid a long, heavy cartridge into his rifle, dropped the breech lock, took a quick aim, and fired. All 3 Indians were disabled now. The trappers climbed leisurely down from the rocks to the canyon floor.
You imagine taking a ball right in the shoulder?
They got like 56 caliber rifles at this point.
Yeah, that's true.
Spencer repeaters.
That's true. They got the repeaters. That's right.
The needle guns.
Yep, that's right. Gosh.
With one swift blow of his hatchet, Jack broke the big box open. Chris Lapp's life work lay before their eyes. Finished to pieces, Johnson said, all matched claws. As he told Jack, the Blackfeet had Chris's best. Jack put up his hatchet and drew his knife. Soon enough, the 3 Blackfeet must bleed to death from their shoulder wounds. All 3 sang their death songs. Jack stepped up to one of them, ran his blade into the eye socket, and flipped the eyeball upon the ground.
Jeez. Oh, just make him suffer a little more.
His victim flinched, but made no more sound than a grunt. "Forgot something?" Jack announced. Replacing the knife and drawing his hatchet, he scalped the Blackfeet, lifting each from the ground by his top knot and whacking the scalp off close to their skulls with the heavy blade. "That's for Mad Mo," he said. Now he took their eyes too. But finally, at Johnson's urging, he went his rounds once more to chop off and collect their heads.
Jeez.
It was a shame, Jack said, not to let them wait for their death. Johnson told him only that they must waste no more time, for they still had hours of work to be done that day. Johnson lifted Chris's trunk, with Jack holding the bridle, threw it on the skittish pack horse's back and tied it on securely. Then each caught a saddled horse, mounted, and with the pack horse in tow, rode out of that canyon and back to Bear Claws. Jack threw his 3 heads on the ground beside the cabin. Both trappers then carried Chris outside and brought huge armfuls of brush and dry saplings. Firing the cabin, they threw yet more of the brush into the open doorway. Now they must sit by the smoking ashes for hours to allow the frozen earth to thaw.
Yeah.
At last they raked ashes and embers to one side and dug Chris's grave. Jack went down the canyon to a stand of box elders and cut some stakes. They wrapped Bear Claw in his own blankets, leaving only his face exposed, and set him into the earth. 35 years I knowed this coon, Johnson said. First met him on the Green River. He says to me, and Jack joined in with Johnson, "Great Jehoshaphat, Pocahontas, and John Smith." Jack removed an armful of necklaces from Chris's box and strewed them into the grave. Next he lifted the box and turned the rest of its contents out upon the ground. "Well now," said Johnson. He stood up and picked up a scalp. Jack spread out the other scalps, more than 100, braided and oiled and hooped.
Jeez.
Never sold a scalp in his life. Never sold a scalp in his life, Jack said. Kept 'em all shined up with his pretties. Over 100 scalps. Kept them all.
Jeez.
Kept them all shined and pretty.
That was like a prized possession, so-called.
They tossed these trophies, too, into the grave, and over all, the loose dirt from Bear Claw's floor. When they had raised a cairn of stones, Jack dug 3 holes, one each at side and head and foot. Here he planted his sharpened box elder stakes. On these he jammed down his 3 Blackfeet heads. At last he stepped back to admire his work. "You know, liver eater," he said, "Indian heads look better without any eyes." Gnarly. Dell, trying to run 2 men's trap lines that day, had as much work as he could handle. He had the feeling that his partners had run into trouble and hurried so that he might be ready to help when they came in. Even so, he did not get back to the cabin until long after dark. When he did return, he found that his friends, for all their adventures, had had the shorter day. The whale oil lamp was already lighted. Hot, juicy steaks waited for Dell on the fire, and biscuits as only the liver eater could brown them. A blizzard raged that night, shaking the new-made cabin to its stone foundations, but the big fireplace glowed. Along with their tales of bear claw, they had winter's cold to remember. Johnson said he remembered a much colder Christmas season, that when Portuguese Phillips rode to Fort Laramie. Dell said that as far as he was concerned, the coldest winter ever was that through which Johnson trekked from Blackfoot captivity. In their reminiscing, they none of them knew that another of their mountain comrades had died late that summer. Against all mountain man tradition, Mariano Modeno had taken off his moccasins and lain down on his porch, on his own front porch, to die.
Jeez.
True to his word, Hatchet Jack performed one more vengeance for Bear Claw, and for all the mountain men whom Indians had shot with rifles, he sought out the traders who had sold needle guns to 3 Blackfeet, killed them, and pulled their heads above Fort Peck. Hatchet Jack.
Yeah, he wasn't having it.
No. He's like those guys who sold these needle guns,
trader
they're dead.
SOBs.
They're dead. Dude, this is just heavy stuff.
It is.
Like, yeah.
And they're laying all their buddies down on the ground, and
these guys have killed some people.
yeah, they've seen some atrocious stuff. Like
With Bear Claw dead and Mariano liver-eating, Johnson and Delgue were the old trappers. And though, to be sure, Johnson is described as having all the vigor of a man in his prime, even in his mid-60s, after their excellent winter's catch, Johnson moved away from old haunts. He stopped in long enough at Leadville, Colorado, for White-Eye Anderson to report on his doings, his official duties in Colson. It says, finally he was to seek stomping room far northwest in Alberta. He just kept trying to go to where the country didn't have people in it, and just Indians. Leadville, far up in the Colorado mountains, won its fame almost overnight as a place where fortunes could be made and lost in a moment's play. Here came Welsh miners and other European immigrants willing to spend their waking hours underground at the sort of labor native-born Americans shunned. Here came gamblers and confidence men from the eastern seaboard. Desperados and hired killers roamed the streets day and night, and prostitutes arrived by every stage. Highwaymen sold their loot, and ambushers sold their services in the center of town. From such old diggings as the Alder Gulch and Deadwood came all manner of swindlers. For in Leadville, they could win their fast buck. Faster yet, buckskin leggings and moccasins were reflected now in patent leather shoes. Mountain men were there. There were no doubt mere figures from vanishing past, but the new breed of outlaws and killers walked carefully around them and avoided exchanges. So he's just saying these old mountain men are still there, running into like new, young, up and coming young people,
city folk. I'm just kidding.
City, country cowboys.
What they call them? Pilgrim. Oh, I can't remember now.
Tenderfoots.
Pilgrim Tenderfoots, that's right.
White-Eye Jack and his partner Yankee Judd were in Leadville as foremen in the Great Bull's Eye Mine. Judd had protested the move to Leadville even after White-Eye portrayed the usual end of a trapper scalpless rotting in some lonely gulch, a feast for the buzzards. Trappers didn't end well generally. Mm-mm. Finally, Judd had agreed that he would work the mines, but only in the summer. The partners worked the same shift and roomed together over at the Rowdy Joe Gow, over the saloon of Rowdy Joe Gow, a gunman from Newton, Kansas. Recommended to them by his friendship for their friend, the late Wild Bill Hickok. Across the street from them lived 20 Cheyenne warriors. Hanging Kettle was their chief, and it was opulent respectability in his tall beaver hat with 4 eagle feathers protruding. One morning in late August, just off their shift at the mine and cleaning up their room, White-Eye and Judd heard unusual bedlam in the streets. Peering out their only window, they could see only that the Cheyennes had deserted their camp. Buckling on their gun belts, they raced to the street. Pushing their way through the hard-packed crowd, White-Eye and Judd found liver-eating Johnson, and at his feet 2 burly but now motionless miners. White-Eye knew them as fighters and troublemakers from his own shift, Lavery and Morgan. Those are the names of the two. Johnson stood silhouetted against the buffalo hide teepees of the Cheyennes, gazing steadily at Bill Greiner, the sheriff of Eagle County. I've been in Eagle County. Back against the crowd stood Del Gue, leaning on his own rifle, and Johnson with a half grin on his leathern face. Greiner was a powerful man, known for his mettle. Give or take 10 pounds, he was as big as Johnson. It was said of him that he rarely had to use his Colt's pistol. It was said that he could subdue a half-dozen ordinary men with his bare hands. His sheriff's star shone splendidly in the morning sun, and he looked Johnson full in the face. "We can't have our citizens knocked around like this, stranger," Bill Greiner said quietly. "Then you better keep 'em off of me," Johnson said. "I ain't killed nobody here, not yet, but them tenderfoots shoved in it on me. I just knocked their heads together." A dozen mountain men in the audience roared approval, and the sheriff thought to tell them that these were not tenderfeet but miners. "All town pilgrims are tenderfoots," Johnson said. "If any but tenderfoots shoved in on me like that, they'd be dead by now." Del Gue chuckled. Wide-Eye, beside him, wondered if perhaps he might head off trouble by telling the sheriff who Johnson was. But now an aged and dignified Cheyenne came through the crowd. Yankee Judd whispered to Del, "That's Hangin' Kettle, that's Hangin' Kettle, the chief." Johnson half turned to greet the old man. "How are you, Hangin' Kettle?" he asked. The old chief craned his neck to see who had recognized him. "Dopiak Absorica," he exclaimed. Then he said to Bill Greiner, "This is the killer of crows. He is the great white chief of the Shoshone. His victims are strewn in all the mountains and the plains. My grandsons, great warriors, were not born when he took the trail of the crows, and my sons were still but boys." "What has this to do with me?" Greiner said. The old chief stood tall to express his scorn. "Dopiak will kill you with one hand," he said. "White lawman, you are only a papoose." For once, Bill Greiner's eyes blazed at a challenge. He turned from the chief who had so disparaged his might back to the mountain man who knocked town pilgrims about. "So you are liver-eating Johnson?" he said. Johnson agreed that he was, then looking Greiner over with some honest admiration, he said, "You're about the biggest papoose this child has ever seen. Are we going to hug?" It says that this is a statement from the story is from Miss J.D. Lee, Greiner's sister-in-law of Red Cliff, Colorado. Johnson, for a moment, the sheriff did want to fight. The anger left his face. And he put out his hand. "I don't think we'll hug," he said. "Welcome to Leadville, Johnson." Two miners regaining consciousness were trying to get to their feet. Johnson wrapped his powerful fingers around the neck of each, raised them, set them down on their feet with a jar the bystanders felt, and sent them running. Then he and the sheriff warmly shook hands.
Big dude.
Johnson rather enjoyed 3 weeks he and Del spent in Leadville. They looked in on such former mountain men as Wide-Eye, Texas Jack, and Colorado Charlie Utter, who had quit their trapping and become tenderfoots. Johnson, as Bill Greiner's guest, watched with admiration how the sheriff handled his rough element. Even Del, watching stagecoach arrivals, was entertained to see eyeglasses and canes and tan shoes and the waistcoated bellies of investors and the painted cheeks of dance hall girls. But the investors looked through Del as if he were not there. Worse, the girls looked at Del more intently than he had liked. If I'd wanted women, I'd grab me one," he said. "But I'm danged if any are gonna grab me." Del urged Johnson to get back to the wilderness in the West, where it still exists. So they rode off into Wyoming. He saw horned cattle. That shocked him. Never seen them before. It said if he had his way, he'd feed them all strychnine. Johnson fell in with Dell's mood. They'll all be wanting us to milk 'em next, he said. Weren't nobody on this Bozeman Trail when the Sioux was out. Nobody but me and Portuguese Phillips. They're just realizing they're old.
Yeah,
and everything has changed.
Oh man, everything has changed.
The Northern Pacific Railroad 2 also stretched toward the Yellowstone. It drew rancor. They didn't like that. At the Powder River, the partners turned right to follow its course. You see the same thing happen with all men that were explorers like that, including Daniel Boone, where they realized like the pristine areas that they roamed for so many years, within 10 years, are completely populated and everything's privately owned. Like that. Like snap of a finger.
Yep.
It turns out that they gave Johnson a message that Dell took as another miserable sign. Sheriff Tom Irvine of Custer County had appointed Johnson as deputy. So he becomes a sheriff's deputy. Dell wanted no part of that railroad town's desperados, though Johnson said that what Griner could do at Leadville with 2 hands, he could do at Colson with only 1. And so rest up for further adventures.
Oh, man.
He just looks for a fight,
Yeah.
But he likes that one-on-one combat or one-on-two or something. But supposing ye are called to kill a white man, Dell asked, in obvious appeal to Johnson's boast that he had never done so. I reckon is how I can keep them galoots in line without killing them, said Johnson. Johnson's decision was firm. He accepted his appointment as a deputy, but so was Dell's decision firm. He set off for the Platte. Dell didn't want no fights.
No.
Ever.
No.
He was always like, oh, man.
All the little stories I think of like Dell is like, he's a softie. He like has a little soft place for those that are suffering or but he's still a hard man. Like,
yeah, and tough and does what he's got to do, but he's kind of like, he's not into all this murder, and he liked to lay low and just do his thing. It says Johnson was a popular deputy with just one element in Custer County, the ordinary citizen who wanted peace. The hardened desperados left town when he moved in, and the sheriff objected that Johnson made too few arrests and so took in too few dollars in fees. Irvine came all the way from Miles City to investigate. Overtaking Johnson on his rounds, he asked him about the roughing up of various prisoners which had come to his ears and their later release. Johnson explained lightly, "Shucks, Tom, them wasn't bad guys, just a little liquored up. All as it takes is to beat them up a little bit and bang their heads together. That settles it. I can keep peace among these here pilgrims." Irvin told Johnson that all lawbreakers must be arrested and sent to Miles City, but Johnson held to his own ways. He didn't want to make their country stand a feed bill on ornery pilgrims. He didn't want to be paid for rounding up people he could keep in check without having to. He just wasn't going to do this for the money. The sheriff recognized defeat, recognized that as long as Johnson had the deputy role, he wouldn't get any money. They'd have the peace, but he wouldn't make money. At that, Irvine was in Colson long enough to see that Johnson was effective. These here pilgrims crossed the street to stay away from him. Tenderfoots followed him all around town. They gawked his giant buckskins weekdays, Basically, he took all their weapons and just kind of the Wyatt Earp way kept them in line. Soon, men bent on fighting planned their fight quietly, then conducted it out of town. If one galoot wants to kill another galoot, that's his right, Johnson said. But Tom said to keep the squabbles off in their streets. Basically, he's just a tough guy. He's like, 2 people want to kill each other, they can do it, just not here.
Yeah. Go out of town.
Earp kind of said the same thing.
Yeah.
Conceivably, Johnson would have had to kill on the job after all if he had been in town the day Henry Lump, drunk, shot and killed Johnson's deputy Muggins Taylor. A bartender arrested Lump and sent him off to Irvine and Miles City before Johnson could return. It says Johnson did a good job then by his own lights and a good enough job by Tom Irvine that he was left in office, but Johnson longed for his wilderness, and Johnson said later that he had been in a black mood wondering what was coming to town when he saw Jake riding up the narrow street. Jake reined in where Johnson was standing, and despite his age, he sprang nimbly from his horse. "I'm clean up from the River Platte, liver-eating," he cried. I brought you news from Dell." Johnson embraced the old man in the bear's grip, and it says, "Remember that time you caught the wolf who trapped you and put his head on a pole. You remember that? And indeed, they could have reminisced, but it was plans for winter ahead that Jake had come to discuss. So they just go hang out a little bit.
Yeah.
They hang out. He says, is Dell going along? And he's like, not unless Johnson goes. And they have someplace they're going to go. They puffed up their pipes for a while. They went out into the stable. Johnson's powerful coal-black horse whinnied and rubbed his nose on his shoulder. It says, the next day, Jake started for the Platte, shrewdly confident that when Dell reached Arkansas Pete's place in Milk River Country, he would find Johnson already there. So Johnson quits being
deputy or whatever.
Deputy and goes back to trapping at some point. Okay, last trail. Well, guess he's all gone up to Milk River. He joins up with Arkansas Pete and Del Gue. And it says, despite his 70 years, Pete was wiry and full of vigor. His hair was gray and hung down to his waist. His mustache and beard were grayer still from wind and weather and tidily trimmed with his pair of shears. He carried with him a Mormon Bible, which his old comrade Mormon Jack gave him, having stolen 2 from a church. Neither could read, but Pete and Jack had a more learned friend teach them whole passages, and then mark their Bibles to show them which passage was which. Pete would saddle his horse, mount, and ride to the top of the bluff just above a copse of willows and cattails. Then he looked up and down the river, but saw nothing that he had not seen the day before. On his last morning alive, he sniffed the air and decided snow was in the offing. That morning would be bright. He saw as soon as the mist left the water, he opened his Bible and began to read. Perhaps Pete was old enough, or sure enough, of his own luck, after so many years, or confident enough while reading his Bible to neglect a careful watch. While he recited from the Psalms, his old gray head bent, a rifle barrel emerged from the copse below him. The rifle spoke, and at its report echoed. Pete raised both hands over his head, still clutching his Bible, and pitched from his horse. The horse whinnied in fear and trotted off. The young Assiniboine warrior who sprang from the copse now found that his heavy bullet had torn clear through Pete's ribs and heart and lungs. He took Pete's scalp and weapons and decided against the Bible. He caught Pete's mount, brought his own well-trained horse from where he had been lying, and led both into Pete's stockade. He must have been watching Pete long enough to be sure he had no partner in the hills, for he worked methodically among Pete's belongings, loading them on 2 of Pete's extra horses. He finished Pete's biscuits. Last he tied Pete's stiffening scalp to his bridle, and riding his own animal, led Pete's 4 horses away into the north. As the sun rose high that day, the Indian and his remuda vanished over the horizon. After night fell, the loons called their wild call in the river, and wolves devoured Pete's body. Getting no answer to his calls, Johnson rode into the open gateway through the low stockade. Dismounted, entered the cabin, and saw how the place had been ransacked. Remounting, closing his gate, loaded the pack horse, he was soon beside Pete's body at the top of the bluff. The skull was clearly Pete's, that of an old man with one front tooth missing. The Bible was clearly Pete's, face down. Johnson picked it up, read for a moment, a marked passage to which it was open, then thrust it into his jacket. Riding into the copse at last, he satisfied himself as to who had shot Pete. Back by the cabin, he removed the supplies from his pack horse, but left them in their tight bundles. He ate from such supplies as the young Assiniboine had left behind. Since his horses must rest after their long day's travel, he prepared now for sleep. Cursing to see how much comfort Pete had made ready for his guests, but when he knocked out his pipe, Johnson took a blanket from the bunk, lay facing the door on the floor. The door itself he left wide open. It says that next he packed just enough of his own supplies to last him a few days. He hid his rifle of the same model of the Assiniboines. By the time the red ball of the sun shone through the river's haze, he was on the Assiniboines trail.
Sucks to be you.
Killed his friend.
Yep.
5 horses had made a wide trail that any tenderfoot could have followed. Johnson contemptuously urged his mount to the gallop. Before long, he had evidence that the confident Assiniboine Assiniboine had made his traveling days short and his camp stops long. Rollicking along at the most leisurely pace, examining his prized loot, Johnson imagined how the Assiniboine must be contemplating himself as a man of wealth and prestige among his people. But his start of a day and a half would hardly be enough to keep him ahead of his pursuer. Spotting from a change of course that the warrior was headed for his tribe's big village, Johnson was the more determined that 2 days' pursuit must be enough. It says that the first night brought the winter's piercing cold. The second night, the Assiniboine camped on the banks of a small stream. After freeing his unburdened horse to graze on sparse vegetation and moss along the bank, he took water from a hole knocked in with ice with his tomahawk and made a roaring driftwood fire. He had shot a goose that day, it seems. So, along with Pete's coffee brewed in Pete's old coffee pot and Pete's flour made into dough and browned on Pete's bread pan, he would have meat. He took time to build a second fire and to rake the first into a bed of live coals. He pulverized Pete's coffee beans with blade of his tomahawk and set water to boiling. He spit both legs of his goose. His hands were in biscuit dough when he heard a voice immediately by him. "Can I get invited for supper?" Johnson asked him. The liver-eater stood warming his hand by the hospitable blaze of the new fire. The Assiniboine had a moment's time to consider. His rifle leaning against a tree was nearer Johnson's reach than his own. His tomahawk lay 10 feet away by the rocks where he had pounded coffee beans. Though his knife was in his belt, he could not draw even this securely with his doughy hands.
He's aft.
He's
You're
in trouble.
in for it.
Yeah. Can I have a fix, Red Indian? Johnson said amiably. He gestured toward the water. Just step down the creek and wash your hands. Just step down to the creek and wash your hands. The proud young Assiniboine snapped the dough from his hand and drew his knife. Johnson seized the knife arm and snapped it at the wrist, dealt him a great blow across the back of the neck, saved him from falling into the fire with a terrific kick that catapulted him over the coals, then sprang after him.
Jeez.
The Assiniboine whirled and crouched to spring, but Johnson, still drawing no arms of his own, struck him across the face with the burning brand from the fire. As the blinded warrior staggered back, struggling to regain balance, his neck was broken by the smash of a fist to his jawbone. Johnson scalped him.
He's just so much power, and obviously like a tail.
Johnson had saved the Assiniboine from falling into the fire, he explained later, to preserve his beautiful wolfskin jacket. Now he took the jacket along with Pete's hooped scalp and sat down to dinner. He said, really cursed himself when he heard the honking of geese for leaving his rifle behind, but he hadn't needed it, he found, after all. Even as he ate, Johnson kept an eye on a storm building up around him. The Assiniboine, he thought, should have hurried on to his village with horses so laden, even if no avenger had been on his trail. Already, though, his campfires were calm in the lee of a small cliff. Great gusts of wind were howling across the prairies, and the first few giant snowflakes fell. Quickly rounding up all 6 horses, Johnson hobbled them out of the wind and not too far from the fires. Next, he pulled on. Basically, he must leave his trademark on the body of the dead Assiniboine. Soon he had the last human liver in his hand. He hung it in a tree to windward of the fire, poked up the embers of the fire, and wrapped himself in his buffalo robe. He slept well. So, he cuddled the Assiniboine's rifle against his beard. At last, a man came into sight, only to jump back at the sound of 3 sharp clicks, the cocking of the rifle. But Johnson was, as always said of such an incident, ashamed not to have known his target sooner. Now he recognized Delgue, so he came in and saw the fire. So it says, Dell asked no questions about the mutilation till after he had sold their furs and reburied Pete on the Yellowstone on the spring, but Dell was never better off for not knowing what Johnson had done with a liver he could always imagine most vividly. So, yeah, he killed the Indian that killed his friend Pete.
Yep.
So he's getting old. I mean, mid-60s or something like that at this point. This Assiniboine sounds like a 20, 19,
Yeah, I would say
18.
young.
Like he sounds like he wasn't watching his back well
No.
and overconfident and yeah. So that's another story Del Gue tells. Johnson and Dell trapped along the Yellowstone and the Muscle Shell again through the middle and late 1880s. Always sharing their take equally, they made out surprisingly well. Dell kept urging that they try Canada again, but after his one season in Alberta, Johnson was resolved to stay in his own country. He didn't like it much. Well along in his 60s, Johnson was still huge and still thought to be the most powerful man on the frontier. Beadler described him in 1887 as still of magnificent physique. He said it was one of his special pleasures to visit the Crow Agency often. There he was respected as a chief. More important, he could reminisce with his old enemies. Dell, though, still wanted better trapping. And it says they exchanged only the swift goodbyes. And it says, watch out for your scalp. And he took off. In 1888, Johnson moved to Bear Creek, building a cabin there. He went on trapping and hunting even after his unanimous election to be first marshal at nearby Red Lodge. Outlaws avoided Red Lodge now, and the occasional hassles with drunks, whom he handled with ease, left him plenty of time to get out and do his traps in the mountains. Johnson made good friends in Red Lodge. To the small boys, he was an awesome being, about whom dreadful tales were told. He was somehow, at the same time, their friend, Ralph Lumley, 60 years later, remembered. I was a small boy at the time he was town marshal here, and he was sure kind to the kids. A road show would be put on in town. The show hall, as it was called, had a large window in the back, and at that time money was scarce with children. There was a saloon adjoining the show hall, and they used to throw out the empty beer barrels, and by placing a couple of these barrels alongside of the window, we could see the show in progress. One time, 4 kids was standing on 2 barrels when we heard a booming voice say, "Get down off of them barrels," and he pulled us down by the seats of the pants. I was in one of those seats. 2 boys got away, and we thought they were sure lucky not to have to go to jail. The marshal was a big man, and he had on a bigger overcoat, as it was winter. He took us to the front of the show, slapped his overcoat open, and put it around us, one on each side, walked right in without the ticket taker knowing what had been done. He sure liked the kids and sure had a kind heart toward them. The other boys were sorry they had run away. Another story from an eyewitness, a boy. Interesting.
Yeah.
So that's the thing about it. We hear things like, that Liver-Eating Johnson was cruel, had no soul, had no kind heart whatsoever and couldn't do anything nice. Yet here he is taking a soft spot with these young people. He saves the Pegan girl. He seeks revenge for Crazy Woman. He takes care of Crazy Woman. He seeks revenge for the Swan, his wife. It's too boiled down to just say black and white. There's no nuance in the discussion. Human beings are complicated.
Yes.
And obviously, in many ways, I think if he was just a monster, he would have been universally hated, not respected.
Right.
But rather, his enemies respected him.
Absolutely.
Admired certain aspects of him while also wanting to kill him and vice versa.
Yep.
He respected the native, too, the Indians. He hangs out with Indians throughout his whole life.
Yeah.
You have others who just hated all Indians no matter what,
right.
It seems like, even though they take a squaw. It was, but it's just people are complex.
Yes.
It says, Red Lodge was only a small new coal town. The citizens there, all Johnson's friends, knew that he was among them only because railroads and Jacob Haish's barbed wire had cut the prairies, even straddled the mighty Rockies. It says that Johnson may have taken to reminiscing a little in his last years. By contrast, for example, to Portuguese Phillips, who knew next to nothing of Johnson after hunting with him a number of times. Packsaddle Ben Greenbow knew a good deal about Johnson after their hunting and batching together one winter. Johnson's neighbors knew he had been born in New Jersey. He told George J. MacDonald's father that he was of Scotch descent, not Irish, and that his name was really Johnston. So it was Johnston, not Johnson.
Yep.
Johnston Jeremiah Garrison.
Yeah, so it was John Jeremiah Garrison Johnston.
Garrison was his last name.
Yeah. So
His
John
surname is,
John Jeremiah Garrison Johnston is what they say.
That's 4 names.
I know.
The people of Red Lodge gathered at least that many of his adventures had been along the Musselshell, and that it says that brave, loyal, and true, he never shirked a duty, never betrayed a friend, never gave quarter to an enemy. Johnson's health failed him all at once around 1895. Though he was among kindly people who did everything possible for him as a matter of common hospitality and friendship, he fretted constantly about having to take charity. His last little plot of land had been sold by 1899. He had been one who prided himself on maintaining himself. Now he felt such pain at constantly taking that at last his friends felt he might be happier in the old soldier's home in Los Angeles. He must surely have felt some irony to be following old John Hatcher 50 years later to the state Hatcher thought the proper place to die. According to Veterans Administration records, Johnston John, also known as John Johnson, entered the Veterans Hospital in December. 1 month later to the day, on January 21st, 1900, he died. If Johnson could never live in a crowd, he was buried in one. To find the last resting place of the Crow Killer, the white chief of the Shoshone, the Curious, must drive from Los Angeles westward on Wilshire Boulevard through Beverly Hills, past Westwood and the Country Club, and ride on Sepulveda, a good name that, Big Antone's. A half a mile along Sepulveda is the cemetery gate. Johnson's section of the cemetery is San Juan Hill. Here are tombstones marching in all directions down into the little valleys and up over the little hills in what seems unending rows. There are no cairns here, such as Johnson helped build for Mad Mo or Bear Claw Chris Lapp, or such as his friends the Crows built for Crazy Woman. Dabiek Absorica is in row D, and the tenderfoots who walk past on their way to decorate other graves see no stakes around him with grinning skulls. The second stone from the road, there's no more trails, bears the abbreviated inscription, John Johnston, KOH 2nd Colorado Cavalry, or J.N.O. Johnson. So we know, though, that probably as a result of this and other things, that they moved him to Cody, Wyoming,
Yep,
right?
1974.
So this book was written prior to that. Yeah. They have a breakdown here of Glossary of Native Peoples and Crow Killer, and they sort of go through each of these people, which is kind of interesting. I kind of already know some of this: Blackfoot, Cheyenne, Crow, Salish, or the Flathead, Nez Perce, Oto, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, Ute, Arapaho. The Assiniboine, though, that was kind of new for me. Their name in English derived from the Ojibwa's original description of them, Stone Sioux. The Assiniboine spoke a dialect of Siouan. By the mid-19th century, their bands occupied a vast region stretching between North Saskatchewan River in Canada to the Missouri River in present-day northwestern North Dakota. So they were kind of your Canadian Lakotas, it seems. I could be totally wrong. It says, today the Assiniboine live on reserves in southern Saskatchewan and reservations, and 2 reservations in northern Montana, Fort Peck and Fort Belknap. Well, hope you guys enjoyed this book reading, this whole series we did. We're going to do a few more coming up down the pipeline here. We're not going to be back in office till probably mid-November. Yeah. We basically have September and October. No, we'll be back before then. We have a few weeks in between on some hunts.
Early October-ish.
September and October is just packed, and November. Yep. I mean, it's the time. So we're going to drop another series that we hope you really enjoy. It's one of my favorite books. It's about Daniel Boone. And if you haven't heard it and you don't know about that time frame in the 1700s, it's going to blow your mind. You got to hear it. It's good stuff. So tune in for that. And as always, if you like what we do, you appreciate our work, like and subscribe to the channel. We're almost to 100,000 subscribers.
So close.
Every comment helps with the algorithm, promotes our stuff in the YouTube. And if you like our show, keep tuning into it on the audio version, on the iTunes podcast, and on Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to check out our sponsors. They're in the description field of our YouTube videos. And we got Mountain Ops, we got Stealthy Nutrition, we got Sheep Feed Orthotics, we got partners like
Dark
Go
Energy,
Hunt, Gear Shop, Dark Energy. You can get a TP from Seek Outside, all that kind of stuff. Initial Ascent backpacks, they're all good deals. And every time you purchase from all those places using our code, it helps us. So we appreciate that. That's it. See you next time. Stay gritty.